The story, Mom with Kids, Fake Plates, and the Courtroom Drama, revolves around an unexpected situation when a 34-year-old mother, Zelika, was pulled over by the police for speeding in Florida. However, the incident didn't end with a simple speeding ticket. It quickly escalated into a tense confrontation when Zelika was suspected of using a fake license plate. She couldn't provide all the necessary documents and kept giving inconsistent stories about the vehicle's registration and the origins of the plate. As the situation became more heated, she began to resist and refuse to cooperate, leading to her arrest with multiple charges. This story is not only humorous, but also ironic, highlighting the trouble people can create for themselves when trying to bend the law without considering the consequences. On March 30th, 2024 in Florida, a place where getting pulled over by the police is not an unusual occurrence for drivers, a police officer on patrol unexpectedly spotted a white Nissan speeding at 49 miles per hour in a 40 miles per hour zone. With the sharp eyes of an experienced officer, he calmly activated his siren and directed the vehicle to pull over. Out of the car stepped Zelika, a 34-year-old mother who appeared completely unconcerned. She was driving with her two young children, who, rather than being worried about the seriousness of the situation, seemed more intrigued by the fact that their mother was meeting the police. "Hello, ma'am. I stopped you because you were speeding at 49 in a 40 zone," the officer began, his tone gentle but serious, as if explaining to a first grader that Zelika's actions were not acceptable. "Please provide your driver's license, vehicle registration, and insurance." And Zelika, though not panicking, seemed a bit flustered as she faced the officer's request. She started rummaging through her wallet, pulling out a pile of papers as if searching for a VIP pass to a concert she hadn't prepared for. The papers fluttered out like a dramatic search, but in the end, all she could produce was a driver's license, while she awkwardly smiled and confessed, "I forgot to bring the registration and insurance," as if this was a perfectly normal and worry-free situation. However, the problem was just beginning. When the officer checked the vehicle's license plate, he noticed it was a temporary plate from Texas, but none of the information matched any registration records in the system. This raised suspicions about the legitimacy of the plate Zelika was using. Meanwhile, Zelika firmly maintained that she had just moved to Florida from New York and that the vehicle was properly registered elsewhere. Yet, the contradictions in her story and the lack of proper documentation made everything more complicated. Things escalated when the officer asked Zelika to step out of the vehicle for further inspection, and she began to resist. She firmly insisted that the license plate belonged to her car, despite the fact that the plate was not valid. What started as a simple speeding ticket quickly turned into a tense confrontation, leading to Zelika being accused of using a fake license plate, failing to register the car, and resisting arrest. But the story didn't end there. Zelika continued to try to persuade the officer, nervously worrying about her two children sitting in the car. Yet, all her efforts were in vain, and the situation ultimately ended with her being arrested. Although the officer had tried to be helpful by only ticketing her for the speeding violation instead of immediately arresting her, Zelika could not avoid facing more serious charges. The story took another twist when the officer examined the vehicle's license plate and discovered something that couldn't be overlooked. The plate came from Texas, but there was no trace of it in the vehicle registration system. The officer, who had dealt with similar situations before, immediately sensed something was wrong. Normally, every license plate is registered with full information in the system and can be quickly checked. However, no data could be found for this plate, raising the officer's suspicions. This was clearly not a coincidence. A fake plate, possibly, but why choose a temporary plate from Texas when the driver had no verification documents? That question lingered in the officer's mind, prompting him to conduct a more thorough inspection. "This plate has no data," the officer said, his voice cold and full of suspicion. He looked at Zelika, waiting for an explanation. "Did you buy the car in Texas?" Zelika, though unfazed by the awkward situation, struggled to come up with a reasonable answer. She could only nod quickly and then offer a rather mysterious-sounding story. "Oh, I'm not from Texas. I just moved here from New York," she explained, her face still smiling, but her answer sounded like it was straight out of a 90s sitcom. The story seemed hastily made up and unconvincing, but Zelika continued as if trying to prove everything was perfectly normal. However, the officer wasn't easily swayed. The contradictions in Zelika's words and the lack of proper documentation made him even more suspicious. With a sharp glance, the officer decided not to let her story drag on any longer. He asked Zelika to step out of the vehicle for further questioning, hoping she would provide authentic information or at least cooperate in the situation. However, Zelika, a determined mother with 2 young children in the car, wasn't ready to comply. "I don't understand why you're asking me about the license plate," she grumbled, her face starting to show signs of irritation. Her response sounded like an unreasonable complaint, as if the officer were asking her to do something completely absurd. "This plate is from my car." The more she insisted, the more she contradicted herself, making the situation even more confusing. Zelika's story didn't match what the officer had discovered, and the more she explained, the messier things became, as though adding fuel to the fire between her and the officer. The confusion, coupled with her defiant actions, further escalated the situation. The officer began to realize that this was no longer just a simple traffic violation, but could involve a more serious criminal act. The more he listened to Zelika, the more he felt the lack of transparency in her story, prompting him to decide not to let things drift further. The climax of the story occurred when Zelika began to resist strongly as the officer moved to seize the fake license plate from her car. Not only did she insist that the plate was legal, but she also became increasingly stubborn and uncooperative. It felt as if the officer's efforts were gradually unraveling, as Zelika, instead of realizing she was in deeper trouble, continued to make illogical explanations about the legitimacy of the license plate. The atmosphere between them grew more tense, as though they were engaged in a mental duel, each with their own clear objective. The officer, though seemingly patient to a surprising degree, maintained his calm. With his professional experience, he understood that in such situations, it was crucial to remain composed and not give in. He gently explained to Zelika once again, trying to make her understand that the license plate she was using was invalid and a serious criminal offense. "You can receive a summons instead of being arrested," the officer said softly, as if trying to help her avoid more serious consequences. "You just need to sign here, and then you'll have to go to court to resolve this matter." Thinking that she might finally be able to escape the awkward situation, Zelika began trying every possible way to convince the officer. She repeatedly begged and asked to speak with her children, as if that would somehow change the situation. "But my children are in the car. Please don't scare them," Zelika cried out anxiously, her voice sounding as though her life was in serious jeopardy. She kept repeating her pleas, as if, without the officer's consent, her life and her children's lives would be completely upended. However, the more Zelika tried to convince him, the more the officer remained firm in his stance. Though the officer seemed regretful to be facing a mother so worried about her children, he couldn't allow the violation to continue. His patience appeared to be running thin, as no explanation could change the situation. Although he understood that Zelika was under great psychological stress, he knew he couldn't ignore her illegal actions. Finally, Zelika was arrested for resisting arrest without causing injury, using an invalid license plate, and speeding. This decision was not an easy one for the officer, but he knew it was necessary to uphold order and justice. Zelika's arrest wasn't just the end of a confrontation between a mother and the police. It was a lesson about how actions lacking transparency and resistance to the law would not lead to favorable outcomes. Even if she was a mother worrying about her children, criminal actions still needed to be addressed, and this was something both the public and authorities needed to understand clearly. When Zelika entered the courtroom, there was no hiding the tension on her face. She had braced herself for a showdown with justice, but was also determined to maintain her dignity and defend herself against the charges. When she declared that she was not guilty of resisting arrest or speeding, it was as though she wanted to assert that, no matter how bizarre the situation seemed, she still wanted to protect her rights. However, when the story of the fake license plate was brought up in court, it was no longer just a legal issue. It became a noteworthy situation. The once solemn courtroom was suddenly filled with astonishment and a touch of entertainment, as everyone seemed unable to stop thinking about the absurdity and illogical nature of Zelika's actions.